So the bell ringer we already answered. Why do you think the U.S. is involved in the Middle East? And you'll see that relates to the third journal that is also due today. But first, we'll go ahead and start with the notes. And we already covered, of course, the we already covered Israel. We covered Europe and the Middle East. And the Iranian Revolution, we already covered that. And if you don't get any of these, of course, they're in the videos, but also the slideshow. And today we'll talk about Iraq. And so I just want to go over three things with that. Of course, a little bit of a background, the actual Gulf War, and then the aftermath. So let's first look at the background a little bit. And of course, Iraq is this country here in the map that you can see. It borders Syria, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And there's three different sides. So these are obviously also countries that we're involved with in the Middle East. We have tension with Iran over nuclear weapons. Syria has been a mess since the civil war happened there in the refugee crisis. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia, which is a major holder of oil reserves. But basically, Iraq also can trace their roots back to a monarchy that was backed by the British. So the British basically protected it as one of its territories, but it allowed it in a very weak way to have its own leadership. And so Iraq did have a monarch or a king for a period of time. And of course, the British were there because they were interested in the oil reserves. And basically, the borders of Iraq and the way it's organized has a lot of British influence. So the Iraqi people didn't necessarily choose for their country to look like this in particular. And part of the difficulty in Iraq is there are three groups of people that do not like each other all the time that are in the same country. And so first, three groups include the Sunni Muslims, which is spelled Sunni, Sunni. And we briefly went into that yesterday. The Sunnis believe, of course, that Muhammad didn't appoint a successor, and it was up to everybody else to try to determine one. They actually make up a small portion of the population of Iraq. The Shia, which is spelled Shia, they once again are the ones that believe that Muhammad picked a successor. They make up the largest percentage of the population of Iraq. So after Iran, they have one of the highest percentages of Shia Muslims. A third group that is more friendly toward the United States and other Western countries would be the Kurds, Kurds. The Kurds are a national group that has a common culture and beliefs and all of that, but they don't have their own country. They often have been nomadic in the past and live in northern Iraq, but also parts of Syria, for instance, and Turkey. So they're kind of spread out all over the place and don't have their own country. Nobody wants them to have their own country because if they did, then they would have to take territory from Iraq or Syria or Turkey. So all those countries are opposed to the Kurds having their own actual country. Eventually, a political party ended up having a coup, taking over. And it would be known as the Ba'ath Party, which is spelled B-A''ATH. That's B-A''ATH. So the Ba'ath Party would have a coup, C-O-U-P, and take over Iraq. So they get rid of the king, and they would take over instead. C-O-U-P. And one of the leaders of this political party that will make himself the leader of Iraq, and this happened the whole way back before the 70s, and that would be Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein was actually in power for a considerable period of time. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim. So even though they made up a much smaller percentage of the population than the Shia, because he was Sunni, he played favoritism toward them quite a bit. And in fact, believing that Iran was weak after the revolution, he decided, of course, to try to attack their country. So many might mistakenly think, oh, this is a Sunni leader fighting the Shia. Well, that's true, but his country was also had more Shia Muslims than Sunni. So he was actually causing a fight between two countries who actually should have had more in common than different. But that war ended up being long and drawn out. It didn't really lead to any major differences that happened after it came to a close. And so years went by, and Saddam Hussein, of course, his main goal was to make Iraq the most prominent country in the Middle East. He figured if he took on someone like Iran and gained territory, it would definitely make Iraq the best country. But that didn't work for him. And so eventually he stewed for quite a few years throughout the 80s. And it wasn't until about the end of the decade that he started to take interest again in gaining territory. And so the country he decided to pick on would be Kuwait. And Kuwait is spelled Kuwait. Now, if you look here, back at the map, Kuwait is a tiny little country that is to the southwest corner of Iraq. So you might think, why would he bother? Is that really going to give him that big of an advantage if he gets their land? And the answer is yes, because Kuwait, compared to the size of their country, has an enormous amount of oil. So a lot of wealth. And so this is where we come to the Gulf War. The first step in the Gulf War was the invasion of Kuwait. Now, if you remember from yesterday, I mentioned during the Iraq and Iran War, America backed Iraq and the Soviets backed Iran to some extent. So Saddam Hussein was actually kind of an ally of the United States. And when we heard, of course, through intelligence that he was thinking about doing this, we warned him not to, and he thought we were kind of just joking. We were saying, don't do that, but wink, wink, you can go ahead and do it. But in reality, we really meant don't do this because it will end up causing havoc in the oil market. It will drive up prices. Gas will be more expensive. And plus, you can't just invade countries. I mean, we sometimes do, but nobody else is allowed to. So we told him not to, but he did it anyhow. And then he had a massive amount of troops on the border of Saudi Arabia, another oil-rich country, and also the home of some of the two most important cities in Islam. So people became worried that he was also going to invade Saudi Arabia. So the United States and many other countries put together an alliance and sent troops to Saudi Arabia just in case to stop him from doing that. It was called Operation Desert Shield. Operation Desert Shield. So it's really meant to protect Saudi Arabia. That would be important until today, because even if the actual Gulf War didn't happen, we just sent troops there and they stayed to protect it. This caused problems for the United States later on. Saudi Arabia has those two holy cities, so some Muslims looked at it as an insult that foreign troops that aren't even Muslim were inside Saudi Arabia. So that caused some of the earlier tension that would eventually devolve into terrorism with organizations like Al-Qaeda, for instance. So some people didn't like it that we went here to help. They basically would say, well, it wasn't right for Saddam to invade, but he's Muslim too, so that wouldn't be as bad as you coming and protecting this country because you're not Muslim. So, just to kind of make a long story short, the war didn't even last that long. We decided to push Saddam's troops out of Kuwait back into Iraq. We decided not to invade Iraq or take out Saddam Hussein, just kind of return things to normal. That was our only goal. And it was pretty quick. And mostly the reason why I have this picture of planes up here is because it was quite a bit of an air campaign, a bombing campaign, in order to accomplish that. Anyway, so where was I? They pushed the troops back out of Kuwait and returned things to normal, mostly through an air campaign. We did have troops on the ground too, but a lot of it was thanks to the air campaign that occurred. The aftermath was, of course, that Saddam Hussein, pictured here in a nice suit, kind of an ugly tie, but he got to remain leader of Iraq. And so the agreement basically left him in power, but it did place limits on his military. We didn't want him to be able to invade another country again. So he had to agree to limits, especially on his own Air Force. The United States, for a long time, kept a no-fly zone that we patrolled to make sure that he didn't have his own fighter jets or bombers taking off. In the meantime, though, Saddam Hussein noticed that some people were upset that we had troops guarding Saudi Arabia. So I will say he appeared to become more religious. He really wasn't. He wasn't religious at all, but he appeared to be more religious to try to kind of kiss up to those people. And he also, because he couldn't expand his country, he then started to turn inward. And so that's when he started to have the oppression of Shia Muslims more often, even though they made up more people. Also the Kurds. There's evidence that he often would have people arrested just because they were from one of those different groups and possibly even executed. He tried to counter that by having people in his administration that were different. For instance, there are Arabs that are Christian, so he appointed an Arab Christian to be one of his major advisors, for instance. So he tried to make it look like he had diversity, but really that wasn't the case. And so that kind of left us in that situation. You didn't really hear from Saddam too much more, of course, until the war in Iraq happened after 9/11. But we'll talk about that in the next unit. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? All right. So for the remainder of the period, you will see just one other thing, which would be the last journal. It's called Unit 1, Journal 3, and it kind of relates to the bell ringer again, so we kind of already did a part of it. And Unit 1, Journal 3 says, reflect on the material you have seen so far. Why is the U.S. concerned with issues in the Middle East? Do you think our involvement is justified or not? Please explain. And for this one, I guess I didn't put in the directions here, so I'll add it right now. But this just needs to be 3 to 5 sentences. Just please make sure that you proofread. Once again, proper nouns at the beginning of sentences should be capitalized. Yeah.
What's that mean?
That means they actually have substance, that you just don't write Middle East bad. We should not be there. So that would not be a thoughtful statement. Yes. Good question. Oh, and just by reading over the second journal, the word there, T-H-E-R-E, is a place. T-H-E-I-R is referring to someone. And T-H-E-Y apostrophe R-E is they are. So don't forget there are 3 different theirs. 3 different theirs. Anyway, just to finish up here, we'll have a little bit of time before the fire alarm, but don't forget the quiz. Don't forget to turn your notes now that we're done. The other thing that I added for bonus is the Unit 1 current events activity. And that is just you can click on one of the links and find an article to read and just type 3 to 5 sentences that everybody else will be able to see. And you just need to paste the address that you got the article from. That's for bonus points. You can do up to 2 of those a week if you'd like. If you're done with everything else, you should do that since you should be doing something for class. So make sure that you have everything done, take the quiz, and if you're done with everything else, make sure that you do those current events for bonus. Does anybody have any questions? Nothing? Okay.